This is a new fanfic story. Hope you enjoy. If you do, PLZ subscribe and like. Spirals Hidden in the Leaves by Mr. Spinner. Chapter 1. The land of fire was truly beautiful as autumn settled in. The swaths of groves and forests slowly changed from light and dark greens to blazing red, orange, and gold. The chill in the air was perfect, a fine balance between the heat of summer and the cold of winter. Had the single traveler on the road to Kanahagakure, the village hidden in the leaves, been in a proper state of mind, he would have enjoyed it. But he was not in a proper state of mind. No, grief weighed upon him like a lead blanket. The hood of his shirt was drawn up, a neckerchief wrapped around his face to keep out the dust. And even then, any passers-by would have felt the haze of sorrow. In the traveler's long-lost culture, it was said that death was not an end. Rather, it was a metamorphosis. Like the emergence of a butterfly from its cocoon, a chick growing into a swan, even the recoloring of the leaves, it was simply a form of change. It was shedding the husk of the material and taking one's place in the pure lands. But that didn't make the loss for the still living any less painful. Especially as this loss was the traveler's only known blood. The traveler clenched his fists and forcibly stood straighter, his strides longer. What was he doing? Had the departed seen him like this, he would have gotten an earful about self-pity and enduring and moving forward. Which was what he was to do. Now he was free to do as he wanted, as were the departed's final wishes. So the traveler straightened his coat and secured the large, chain-wrapped scroll hanging across his back. It was only a few miles away, the hidden village. He would make a new life for himself there. And he would slowly begin to rebuild. The village of Kanahagakure was, to all intents and purposes, a strong and vibrant community. Its ninja were powerful, its economy stable, and its people generally friendly. Had it not been known beforehand, few would guess that a great tragedy had befallen the village a mere 7 years previous. On that forsaken day, the terror known as the Nine-Tailed Fox had appeared in the village and unleashed its hateful fury. Only the bravery and power of Minato Namikaze, the fourth Hokage, had been able to defeat the beast, to minimize the damage. If one could call all the destruction and death that had still been inflicted, minimized. The darkest day in the village's history was a sore point for most of the village. Everyone had lost someone to the Nine Tails that day. But the damage had been repaired, and grief had started to heal. The only problem remaining, at least to most of the populace, was that the fox was still alive. Sealed away inside a small boy. Naruto Uzumaki. Said boy could be found, as per usual for him, sitting at the Ichiraku ramen stand. What was not usual was the air of melancholy that had settled over the usually energetic boy. Rather than scarfing down his favorite meal, he stirred his chopsticks in the broth, only occasionally taking bites, and even then with far less gusto. Young Naruto had started at the Shinobi Academy last year, the standard age. He didn't really care for the academy, finding most of the classes boring and constricting. He wanted to be a ninja, already. To learn awesome ninjutsu and protect the village. To prove to the villagers that seemed to hate him for no reason, once and for all, that he was worthy of their praise. Of anyone's praise. To that end, he had chosen to strive for the most respected position in the entire village, the mantle of the Hokage, the Fire Shadow. The most powerful ninja in the village, the leader who guided the village into prosperity. He knew that if he could become the best, that if he could earn that white hat, he would finally earn the respect he craved. And while on any day he would loudly proclaim his goal with pride and utter confidence, today was different. Try as he might, he couldn't get those damned words out of his head. You'll never be the best. You barely have a name, much less a clan. You're a nobody. Naruto winced as the memory returned yet again, clenching his eyes shut against the faint sting of tears. Those words had been spat at him by a girl in his class, not to his declaration that he would become Hokage, but to his near-daily challenge against Sasuke Uchiha. Sasuke, who had a veritable club of fangirls at the ripe age of newly 8 years, who was strong, and cool, and everything Naruto secretly wished he himself could be. But it was the last part that had hit him the hardest. Nobody. He had a name, Uzumaki. One that he was determined to spread across the elemental nations as a name of pride, respect, and fear from the enemies of Konoha. But now, it was just a name. He wasn't even sure it was really his since his parents were dead and he knew precious little about them. It may have come from his father, or his mother, or it may have been made up for his sake as a baby. As Naruto slowly worked through his emotions, he could only wonder one thing. What did his name really mean? As the sun hit the midway point between noon and the horizon, the gates of Konohagakure were manned by a pair of newly minted chunin. Both were only part way through their shift and completely bored. Gate duty was generally dull at the best of times, and today foot traffic had been slow. As one chunin lightly dozed, the other straightened as he caught sight of a single person on the road. He tossed a metal ball bearing at his partner, jarring him from his nap to stand at attention. It took a few minutes for the stranger to finally reach the gate, which gave the guards plenty of time to assess him. Average height, slender build beneath a blue neckerchief, hooded shirt and leather coat, with a large leather scroll case wrapped in chains slung across his back. The aforementioned hood and a neckerchief kept them from catching anything else until he was right before them. The stranger gently removed his hood and pulled down his neckerchief to reveal a brunette with brown eyes and a darkly tanned complexion, a bandage on his right cheek. "Good day, gentlemen," the man said solemnly. "Identification," one of them said, his dull tone bred from repetition. The man nodded and produced a few sheets of paper. The chunin's eyebrow rose at the sight of, not a passport, but a library card. A library card from the land of cliffs with a photo that matched the man before him. The chunin winced at the irregularity but sighed and handed it back. While passports were the general form of identification, official documents such as checkbooks, birth certificates, and even library cards were technically allowed. "Enjoy your time in Konoha," the chunin said. The man nodded and moved along. The other chunin guard watched the man carefully as he moved down the road, eyes narrowed. After a few moments he shrugged it off. If the stranger caused trouble, the Anbu would handle it. So self-assured, neither chunin noticed the stranger wander off the main road of the village and into the shadow cast between two buildings. So hidden, he peeled the bandage off of his cheek, revealing the underside to bear an intricate ninja seal. The stranger produced a lit match and burned the tag, destroying the seal and the transformation anchored to it. His appearance wavered for a moment, only to resettle onto fair skin and blue-gray eyes. But what really stood out was his hair. Hair of a bright scarlet hue. After a while, Naruto was able to work his way out of the funk he'd been in since class ended. He hardened his resolve, determined to prove any of his doubters in class or the rest of the village wrong. Few may know his name now, but that would change. When he became Hokage, the name Uzumaki would ring with awe and respect throughout the land. Naruto pumped his fist and dove into his tragically lukewarm ramen. But hey, lukewarm was better than nothing, and he wasn't so monstrous as to throw away perfectly good food, especially ramen. Naruto chomped down on his food, already thinking about challenging Sasuke the jerk to a fight tomorrow to show him who was boss, when someone sat beside him. "What is that delectable smell?" the man asked. Naruto's mouth fell open, letting half-chewed noodles fall back into his bowl. "This is Ichiraku ramen, you know. It's the best food in the world, the food of the gods." "Naruto, calm down," said a lovely teenage girl behind the counter. Ayame, daughter of the owner and one of the few people who treated him right. She wagged her finger at him before smiling at the newcomer. "What can I get you, kind sir?" The man tapped his chin for a moment, eyes wandering the menu, before nodding to himself. "I think I'll take salt ramen with mushrooms and garlic," he said simply. "Coming right up," Ayame replied before heading back into the kitchen. As they waited, the man glanced at Naruto, then at the non-steaming bowl before him. I've never met someone who preferred cold ramen," he commented. "But then again, who am I to judge?" Naruto frowned and glared at his cold noodles before slumping down. "I don't like it cold. I got all broody and ignored my bowl. But cold ramen is better than nothing." The man quirked an eyebrow and smiled, drawing a small book from his pocket. He opened it to the inside cover and pressed a thumb to a seal emblazoned in the leather. With a pulse of chakra, he produced sealing paper, a brush, and chakra-infused ink. A few deft strokes and another chakra pulse later and he resealed all of his gear, leaving only the tag. Naruto had watched all of this with wide eyes. This guy was a ninja. Before he could follow this line of reasoning, the newcomer had slipped the sealing tag under his bowl. The seal flared with orange light and, within seconds, the broth and noodles were steaming again. Whoa. Cool, the boy said before digging in. Guess that counts as my good deed for the day, the man said with a faint smile. As if on cue, Ayame returned with a steaming bowl, the man's order. He nodded his thanks and clasped his hands, uttering the traditional, "Itadakimasu," before taking a bite himself. A single bite was all it took for the man's eyes to balloon. After a second, he was scarfing it down like his life depended on it. When he was done, the man gave a contented sigh. He waved for Ayame's attention and asked for her name. Upon receiving it, I have traveled all over the world and tasted ramen from pretty much anywhere that isn't too far east. And this may very well be the best ramen I have ever had. The man grinned. My sincerest compliments to the chef. Ayame smiled kindly. I'll be sure to tell my father, she assured before returning to the back. Naruto had to clamp his hands over his mouth to keep from laughing. So you liked it? He squeezed out. I did, he said. Very much. I'll have to come back here soon. The man stood and pulled on the leather coat that he'd kept over his lap. As he settled it around his shoulders, Naruto caught a familiar symbol etched into the left breast. The swirly thingy that lots of ninja wore on their backs or shoulders. Naruto's thoughts were interrupted by a hand thrust into his view. One that was attached to the newcomer. Thanks for the recommendation, he said. The name's Ken. What's yours? Naruto paused before answering. Was this guy not afraid of him? He wasn't glaring, and he was actually being friendly, like Ayame or Teuchi or the Hokage. He smiled as he resolved not to think about it too hard. He took the man's hand in a firm grip, or as firm as a 7-year-old could muster. Naruto, he answered, deciding to omit his last name for some reason. The name's Naruto. In his office, Hiruzen Sarutobi tapped his favorite pipe on his desk, settling the tobacco before returning it to his lips. When he'd woken up this morning, he had expected a rather typical day. Paperwork mostly, handing out missions, judging the economic and emotional state of the village at large. You know, the usual. He had not, in any way, expected the emergence of one of his greatest regrets. Before him, sporting a bruised cheekbone and split lip, sat a young man in chakra-suppressing manacles. When they had clicked over his wrists, the boy had examined the seal work on the manacles, clearly interested. After a few moments, he had abandoned his examination and settled to return Hiruzen's stare with minimal flinching. How he had ended up here was quite the odd story, according to his Anbu guards. The young man had arrived at Hokage Tower and asked, quite politely according to the shinobi at the front desk, to see the Hokage on a matter of utmost importance. She had, with equal courtesy, informed him that the Hokage was busy and offered to set him up an appointment a few days from now. That, apparently, had been the wrong thing to say. The young man had strolled past the front desk with a scowl on his face and attempted to find him on his own. After ignoring warnings, he had engaged a number of administrative chunin in hand-to-hand combat. Intermixed with kicks and punches, he had planted unusual seal tags on several of the shinobi, which had blocked their chakra and caused severe disorientation. If he was right, such skill in sealing techniques was not a surprise. After the administration had failed to bring him down, the Anbu had gotten involved. And when Anbu got involved, things tended to move along much faster. As per protocol in such situations, the Anbu had escorted him to the T&I department, where he was to be held until a high-ranking shinobi could interrogate him as to his motives. Upon being apprehended and locked in this very chair, only then had he delivered the phrase that had shaken the third almost to his core. The whirlpool has returned to the forest. The Anbu had dutifully delivered this message to him in hopes that it would lead to cooperation in the investigation, the one that had brought Hiruzen such shock. On his command, the Anbu had escorted the man to his office and left, sealing the room behind them. That had been 15 minutes ago, during which Hiruzen had examined as much of the situation as possible. Very few knew exactly how much meaning was behind the elements of that single phrase, and even fewer still of this young man's age. Which means he had to have learned from the source. The young man before him was of average height and slenderly muscular build. His skin was pale and his eyes, a bright blue-gray, were firm and unyielding. He was dressed in a long-sleeved gray hooded shirt with drawstrings, a familiar symbol sewn into the left breast, with a blue neckerchief, rust-red cargo pants and leather boots. A large scroll case wrapped in chains sat beside him, something he'd had on him when he'd been arrested and refused to part with. But what drew attention more than anything else was his hair. A bright shade of scarlet that was just long enough to hang at the line of his shoulders and pulled back in a loose tail, a color that brought memories from several times in his life to the forefront of his mind. It brought to mind a noble and dignified woman whom he respected almost as much as her husband that was his own teacher. It also brought to mind a young Spitfire who had taken all who knew her by storm. And it brought to mind a tragedy in the Hidden Leaf's history, one that the modern populace had tragically forgotten. Hiruzen took a moment to mold sensory chakra, to expand his perceptions and examine the boy further. And what he felt left no question. The boy's chakra was shining, vibrant, and overflowing with vitality. The signature was different, of course, but everyone had subtle differences. It was also too similar to those he'd known before to be a coincidence, and the manacle on his wrists would prevent him from disguising that signature. Even if he could have hoped to falsify that sheer sense of vitality. "I know of your people, boy," Hiruzen said, finally breaking the silence. "So why, after all this time, have you come here?" "For permanence," the boy replied evenly. "Ever since I was born, I have known nothing but change, never living anywhere for longer than a year. This village and mine were once allies, long ago. I had hoped that you hadn't forgotten old friends." Hiruzen pressed his lips into a thin line at the boy's tone. It wasn't accusatory, per se, but he was still pressing the concept of allies and old friends fairly thickly. And though he had expected this, it still hurt a bit. After all, he was far from wrong. "And what, pray tell, do you hope to do here?" The boy gave a sardonic smile. "I would prefer to be a ninja, Lord Hokage. But if that is not possible, I have an alternative. I am quite familiar with my clan's famed skill set and would be open to becoming a consultant of sorts in that area." Hiruzen sat a bit straighter at these words. Assuming he was being truthful, and his examination of his manacles gave credence to his honesty, it would be a significant asset to the village. "But first, you thought it would be a good idea to begin a prospective shinobi career by forcing an audience with their leader. Your hypothetical commander." The boy paled a bit but pushed on. "I have precious little money, Lord Hokage. How was I to live even a few weeks in this village? No, I thought expedience would be a better course." Hiruzen chuckled at that, reminded once again of lost friends. He tapped his fingernail against the stem of his pipe as he thought over the situation. Whether as a shinobi or a sealing specialist, the boy's apparent talents would be of great use to the village. And he was right. A great debt was owed to this boy, to his bloodline if not to him personally. And deeper than that, he felt that this boy, this young man, meant no harm to him or his own. He truly wanted to serve to the best of his ability. To serve something greater than himself. After several minutes of silent deliberation. "Very well," he said. The young man's eyes widened. "What?" he asked. "I will allow you to test for skills as a shinobi. Should you meet our expectations, you will be placed into our ranks as a genin, subject to examination through your mission record. For all intents and purposes, you will be a shinobi of Konohagakure." With a single hand sign, he summoned an anbu to unlock the manacles from his unexpected guest's wrists. After that, he removed a set of blank registration forms from his desk and handed it to the redhead. "Fill these out, please," he said with a grin. The young man nodded and took a pen, making quick work of the forms. After taking them back, along with a folder with the young man's previous mission records, Hiruzen looked them over, committing each and every word to his impressive memory. After finishing the forms and signing off, Hiruzen stood and shook the young man's hand. "Welcome to Konohagakure, Ken Uzumaki," Hiruzen said warmly. The young man, Ken, nodded with a smile. Over the next 10 minutes or so, the two hashed out Ken's living arrangements for the time being. In the end, he was to be given an assigned house owned by the Sarutobi clan and an advance on his pay from the Konoha government to live off of. To be paid off after he began either taking missions or filling commissions on seals. Preferably both. His examinations to determine his fitness to be a shinobi were to be given 2 days from now, after which he would be assigned to a team to help him adjust to Konoha. After everything was settled, Ken swallowed thickly, one last question on the tip of his tongue. Lord Hokage, I thank you for your support, and patience and lenience. But I have to ask. He winced faintly, but took a deep breath and soldiered on. Have I any relatives here? He closed his eyes, clearly in preparation for disappointment. Hiruzen grinned. There is a single Uzumaki here, a resident of the village. Ken's eyes shot open and he stared at the old Hokage in disbelief. Would you like to meet him? The silence from Ken was answer enough. Hiruzen summoned one of his Anbu and ordered him to locate the boy and bring him here immediately. The Anbu left without a word. After a quarter hour of waiting, the Anbu returned to the office, carrying a struggling boy over his shoulder. Hey, put me down. I mean it, this is no way to treat your future boss. The Anbu unceremoniously dropped the boy, bowed to the Hokage, and disappeared. The child stood up and angrily brushed the dust off his black shirt, adjusted his goggles, and turned to face him. What's the big idea, old man? If you wanted to talk, you could have just had your guy say so, or meet me at Ikiraku's. I'm all for spending time with ya, you know. So what's so important that I get friggin' kidnapped? Naruto, Hiruzen said with a tone that bespoke saintly patience. Perhaps you would like to meet your cousin. Naruto froze and looked to the other person in the room, the one who had turned around at the sound of his name. Someone that Naruto recognized. You? He asked. You, Ken replied, stunned at the sheer coincidence that they had met earlier in the day. The two stared at each other for a few moments, neither blinking. Hiruzen coughed into his fist to break the silence. Ken Uzumaki, meet your little cousin. Naruto, this is Ken. Spirals hidden in the leaves by Mr. Spinner. Chapter 2. As the moon reached its peak in the sky, its silvery beams found Ken Uzumaki in arguably the strangest place he'd ever been. Up until now, that spot had been held by camping in the bamboo and great mushroom forests of the land of Flora. That had been strange, even though he himself loved mushrooms. But tonight found him lying on his bedroll, on the floor of a room in an orphanage. The evening was like a haze to him, one of his oldest and least likely dreams having come true in a most unexpected way. He still had family. Family that had been in Konoha this whole time. Told you so, grandfather, Ken thought, faux smugness mixed with aching grief. If only his grandfather had agreed to come to Konoha, could they have re-established the fledgling clan even earlier? As the night wore on and sleep continued to elude him, Ken thought over everything that had happened after the Lord Hokage had introduced the long-lost cousins. Naruto, unsurprisingly, had been a mix of joyous and furious with the news. He had tackled Ken in a hug, which then devolved into pounding him with his little fists as he begged and demanded with tears streaming from his eyes where he had been. Why had he never met him? Why now to show up out of nowhere? When Naruto had calmed down, Ken had explained the broad strokes of his story, the ones that were not immediately painful. He and his guardian had stayed away from Konoha for personal reasons, ones that Ken himself disagreed with but respected. That was also why they had never met until now. And now that his guardian had passed away, he had decided to finally come to the village and set down roots. After his explanation, Hiruzen had formally offered Ken legal custody of Naruto, as his only living relative. Ken, predictably, had been stunned. Sure, he was in his 20s, but he had no experience in raising a child. But one look into those big, blue eyes had had him agreeing without even realizing it, and so here he was, in Naruto's room at the local orphanage. Much of Naruto's belongings were packed already. The caretakers of the orphanage had been remarkably helpful in that regard. Suspiciously helpful, given the odd glares they had shot the child all through the process. Frankly, had the Hokage not needed at least several hours to arrange the assigned house for them, he would have moved them out immediately. A particularly loud snore drew Ken's attention to his new cousin. Clansmen may have been the more accurate term for those as distantly related as them. But the Uzumaki clan had never been much for formality. Cousin it would be. On impulse, Ken sat up and examined the boy. His face was in profile, the other side mashed into his pillow and thin blanket. Ken's gaze was naturally drawn to the boy's blonde hair, a sharp contrast to his own scarlet locks. Part of him was disappointed that Naruto didn't bear the red of an Uzumaki, but that was easily brushed aside. Part of him was disappointed that Naruto didn't bear the red of an Uzumaki, but that was easily brushed aside. If the stories were to be believed, Uzumaki Red had always had a hard fight against blonde jeans. Tsunade of the Sanin, granddaughter of the famed Mito Uzumaki, was further evidence of that idea. The next thing he examined was the strange marks on Naruto's cheeks. Objectively, they resembled whiskers. It was highly unlikely that they were birthmarks, at least natural ones. Birthmarks were never so symmetrical, especially in numbers of 6. Curious. Finally, he looked over Naruto as a whole. This boy, like him, embodied the last hope of the all but lost Uzumaki clan. He had clearly had a hard life given the glares they had received from the villagers on their brief trip to the orphanage. But perhaps now, Ken felt pressure build in his throat, his eyes beginning to burn, and a tear rolled down his cheek. He gently ran his fingers through the blonde spikes on Naruto's head. Just as his grandfather had done to him as a boy. We are family, Naruto, Ken thought with conviction. The forgotten legendary conviction of the Uzumaki. And I will not let anyone hurt you. With that, Ken brushed the heel of his hand over his eye to wipe away the tears and settled back into his bedroll. It was late, and the Hokage had requested that he have another visit in the morning. Something vague about things he needed to know about the village. After dropping Naruto off at the academy section of the campus, Ken made the short way to the administrative doors of Hokage Tower for his appointment. He passed the front desk with no incident, though he did receive a nasty look from the ninja manning it. One of those that he had beaten up yesterday, if the bandaged nose and pair of black eyes were any indication. After passing the Anbu guards, Ken found the Hokage writing something. Apparently taking the first crack at the mounds of paperwork on his desk. Ken took a seat and removed a small book from his coat, deciding to read to pass the time. But no sooner had he found the correct page than Hiruzen put aside his form and fixed Ken with a firm look. "Good morning, young man," he said, warmth somehow bleeding through his faint scowl. Was he angry or just uncomfortable? Ken replaced his book and sat up. "Any word on when I can become a ninja?" Ken asked. Above everything else, he needed to start making an income. Hiruzen cracked a faint smile at that, something in his gaze saying he knew Ken's reasons for the inquiry. "As I said yesterday, you will be tested tomorrow morning. I have arranged for our Jonin commander and a pair of academy instructors to test you out." His faint grin faded. "But this is not why I have summoned you here. There are things you must know to be a shinobi of Konoha, and even more so if you are to be Naruto's guardian." Ken lifted his eyebrows in surprise. The ninja thing, sure, he could understand needing specific knowledge for that. But what did any of this have to do with Naruto? "I am certain," Hiruzen continued, "that you are somewhat familiar with the Nine Tails attack almost 8 years ago." Ken nodded. Eyes narrowed in confusion. "Well, there are parts of that night that the village has carefully kept hidden." With those cryptic words, the Hokage launched into a detailed account of Naruto's parents. Particularly their backstories and even more so their roles in the village. This was followed by a detailed account of everything he knew about the Nine Tails attack. By the end of it, Ken was more speechless than he'd ever been in his life. Naruto had never been the most quiet or still student even at the best of times. He had more energy than he knew what to do with and could never seem to keep still for more than a few moments. In addition, he had a rather short attention span in regards to anything he deemed uncool. Which was about 90% of the academy curriculum, but today he struggled to focus on the lesson for an entirely different reason than boredom. Quite the opposite, he was excited beyond belief. He had family. As sudden and as unexpected as his arrival was, Naruto was thrilled beyond belief to be able to say that. True, Cousin Ken had asked him, very clearly and firmly, to keep his existence a secret for now. When Naruto had asked why, Ken had huffed a laugh and asked him to just humor a paranoid fool. Naruto had laughed and agreed to keep quiet until Ken said otherwise. "Naruto, pay attention." Iruka barked, drawing his focus back to the present. Naruto grumbled, but did as he was told. But even as he tried to absorb the lesson, this one on geography of the continent, he couldn't help but think about Cousin Ken and what would happen after class. He'd said they would be moving into a house owned by the old man, and that soon Ken would test to become a ninja. When Naruto had asked if he could be tested, Ken had fixed him with a stern look and asked him what chakra was. Naruto had paused and tried to recall the word that he'd definitely heard in the academy, but had come up short. Ken had chuckled and ruffled Naruto's hair with promises that graduation would come sooner than he thought. When he was ready, and not a moment earlier. Now, class, you'll be meeting Instructor Daikuko in the training yard for taijutsu practice, Uruka announced. Naruto brightened at that and hurriedly packed his things before racing out of the classroom, chased by Uruka's cries to stop running. Rather than simply slow down, Naruto had an idea and turned on his heel to, much more slowly, return to Uruka's room. Naruto. Uruka asked in surprise as he straightened his notes. Is everything okay? Naruto took a deep breath and swallowed before speaking. Instructor Uruka, what exactly is chakra? Ken's eye was twitching. In addition, his jaw was clamped shut, his lips were pressed firmly together, and his fingers had a death grip on the armrests of his chair. But then, this reaction would be rather typical for anyone who had heard the tale he'd been told. A tale of love and loss, of joy and tragedy, of hope and despair. The story of Naruto's parents, Minato Namikaze and Kushina Uzumaki. Most of all, the story of how they had died and the secrets that surrounded that night. Ken took a deep breath and let it out. Slowly easing his grip on the chair. Only after several repetitions and finally releasing the wooden rests did he allow himself to speak. After 7 years, do you really think your laws have had the desired effect? Ken bit out, just barely keeping his voice level. Hiruzen sighed, smoke pouring from his nose with the action. Unfortunately, I cannot, he admitted. While the law of secrecy upon Naruto's status was meant to protect him, I fear I sorely underestimated the tenaciousness of hatred. Ken growled and massaged his forehead. That was the understatement of the century. But as much as part of him wanted nothing more than to scream at the top of his lungs and hurl insults and profanities at the man before him, he held himself back. For one, Hiruzen had acted with the best of intentions and the faith in humanity that Ken's own grandfather had often tried to keep up. For another, he felt he had already pushed his luck with insubordination the day before and would gain absolutely nothing with empty words. The past had come and gone, but the future could still be changed. Lord Hiruzen, Ken started, weighing each word with as much care as he could. I formally request that you revoke the law of silence regarding Naruto's status. Immediately, Hiruzen narrowed his eyes. He'd anticipated the request, though not its suddenness. On what grounds? He asked. Neither agreement nor denial. Pragmatism, Ken replied. As well as simplicity. It clearly has not worked out like you had hoped, and the fact is that the children of this village hold Naruto in disdain for reasons they don't understand in the slightest. They deserve to know. But far more than that, Naruto deserves to know. He deserves to know why he has been scorned by the village for seemingly no reason at all. Not to mention he can begin to come to grips with his duty as a Jinchuriki, and the law regarding his parents. Hiruzen asked. Ken licked his lips before answering. While I don't like it at all, I can understand why you would keep that a secret. Even on the road his entire life. Ken had heard of the infamous yellow flash and felt the awe and outright fear the man had instilled in the enemies of Konoha. There was no way in hell that a man who had slaughtered entire enemy battalions by himself didn't have powerful enemies. Enemies Ken was doubtful he could protect Naruto from at this point in either of their lives. I don't want it changed toward the public, he admitted reluctantly. But I would like permission to tell him about his mother and to reassure him about his father. Perhaps give a few details and tell him why he can't know more. That should satisfy him for now. And when I believe he can keep it to himself, then I want to be able to tell him. Hiruzen considered the young man's request. In truth, he had been considering such a thing for some time now. Ken was right, the law hadn't changed much. Really, all it had done was prevent Naruto and his peers from learning of and appreciating the tremendous service Naruto provided to the village by containing, and someday hopefully channeling, the power of the Nine Tails. And such secrecy had led to Naruto being ostracized, just as Jinchuriki and other villages were, with absolutely no idea why. After a little more thought, he nodded. I will announce the dissolution of the Nine Tails secrecy law at the end of next week, he said. Now my schedule is rather full for the next several days, so if there's anything else you need to know, I'd suggest you ask now. Ken thought for a moment and shook his head in reply. Very well, Hiruzen conceded, checking the clock on his desk. Teams will be arriving for missions soon, so I suggest you get some lunch. The academy lets out after 3 p.m. After you pick Naruto up, he passed Ken a slip of paper, a bronze key, the check for his loan and a small amount of cash for lunch. This is the address you will be moving into. Ken took the proffered items with a respectful nod of his head and left, mulling over everything he had learned. He secured the strip of leather chain-wrapped scroll case across his back and placed a hand at the smaller scroll he had used to store Naruto's belongings in a process that had left stars in the boy's eyes. After wandering for a few moments, he ducked into a small restaurant and ordered the cheapest thing he could find. Ramen and water. Ken took a wind-up timer from his coat and set it for 3 hours, about the time it would take before the academy let out for the day. With that done, he brought out his project book and unsealed his gear to get to work finishing his current pet project. When his ramen order came up, he sampled it with a smile, one that dimmed a bit as he tasted it. Oh sure, the flavor and consistency were good, but it lacked a certain something. Great, he thought wryly. I think Ichiraku has ruined me after only one meal. Naruto swallowed thickly as he sat on a familiar swing at the academy and watched his classmates being picked up by their parents. He fixated on a boy from his class whose name he couldn't remember being picked up by his father, the man scooping the kid up with joyous laughter reflected back by the sun. Naruto felt his insides squirm at the sight. His eyes burning with tears he fought to keep from spilling. A familiar wave of loneliness and sorrow began to rise up, only to be banished by a sharp whistle from the familiar redhead waving at him. Naruto leapt off his swing and crashed into Cousin Ken, almost but not quite knocking him over. After a chuckle and hair ruffle from him, he took Naruto's shoulder and led them to their new home. The house was, at first glance, nothing to look twice at. It was situated in a residential district a mere block from the Sarutobi clan compound and was a squat, sturdy, single-story affair of red brick and a slate roof. A small yard was shaded by strategically placed trees and surrounded by a wrought iron fence. Overall, it was way better than the orphanage. Naruto could hardly contain his excitement at their new home and couldn't restrain himself from running inside as soon as Ken had unlocked the door. He ran through the house to check out the bedrooms, claiming one for himself. There was a nice kitchen, a study, and even 2 bathrooms. 2. A quick look out the back windows revealed a large backyard surrounded by another fence with trees lining the outside of the fence for privacy. Whoa. This place is awesome, Naruto shouted. Well then you should start making your mark, Ken commented, revealing Naruto's freshly unsealed belongings. Go start setting up your room. Naruto grabbed his stuff and bolted, slamming the door shut as he did. He only had time to put a comforter on his new bed when a harsh swear from Ken brought him back to the living room. Ken was trembling and holding a long slip of paper. Cousin Ken. Naruto asked hesitantly. You okay? Ken took a moment to answer. Yeah, kiddo. I'm good. Just surprised. Sorry I startled you. Naruto stared at him quizzically before shrugging and returning to his unpacking. Ken was weird. But that would make him fun. Ken kept an eye on Naruto's door to make sure he was alright before glancing back at the check from Lord Hokage he hadn't bothered to look at before. He had been raised to be frugal on the road and the amount written on this thing was, well, it bordered on the obscene for 2 people. He'd be able to pay off half the loan just by returning half the money up front. Ken shook his head and picked up a small stack of papers on the coffee table. Instructions and guidelines for their stay, common to any assigned housing, locations of provided products such as dish soap and laundry detergent as well as towels and the like. Also for assigned housing, and a small letter from the Hokage. Ken opened the letter and read it carefully. It opened up with his hopes they were settling in, followed by instructions as to where and when he was to be examined for his shinobi rank. With assurances that he could bring Naruto to watch as it was a Saturday. Then he had written something he had forgotten to mention in their earlier meeting. The location of a shrine of the Uzumaki clan on the outskirts of the village, with a mental note to look into that later. Ken removed the scroll from his back and unwound the chains to unfurl it a bit, unlocking the first seal that came up. A tall, bound stack of large sealing tags appeared and Ken picked them up. Carefully examining the layout of the house, he began methodically placing them onto the walls and activating them with long pulses of chakra. Konoha was supposed to be safe. And he honestly felt he could trust Lord Hiruzen. But paranoia was a hard habit to kick. And who knew what psychos would leap at the chance to get at a true Uzumaki that had wandered through the gates, in a top-secret facility in Konoha. A dark figure examined the report from one of his spies within the village. A young man had entered the village yesterday with bright red hair and a familiar symbol on his clothing. He had met with the Hokage and been taken in. The figure thought over this development, its implications, possible ramifications, and the ways he could arrange to benefit from it. Dinner was a somewhat awkward affair in the newly established Uzumaki household. Ken had whipped up a simple meal of rice, roasted chicken and string beans that towed the line between average and genuinely delicious. But Naruto, after getting over his disappointment that it wasn't ramen, had been distracted into silence by the ceiling tags that littered the walls. Seriously. They were so numerous that it was almost like a second layer of wallpaper. And they were on the windows and doors, too. Do all ninja houses look like this? Naruto asked. I wouldn't know, Ken answered with a shrug. I've never been in a ninja's house except for he hesitated briefly, my grandfather. Your gramps was a ninja? Naruto asked brightly. Yep. Anbu, actually, had a good and quirky reputation before he had to retire from an injury he couldn't heal up from. Ken smiled a bit at something his grandfather had once said in regards to his quirks. You could always tell an effective higher-ranked ninja by the presence of odd personality traits. Whoa. Naruto gasped. So that means you're gonna kick ass at this test thing tomorrow, right? Ken straightened up and looked Naruto in the eye. Teaching moment, he commented, pointing his chopsticks at his little cousin. Naruto, first rule of being a ninja or anyone else in life, never underestimate your opponents. Confidence in yourself is a good thing, yes. But overconfidence will kill you just as fast as a blade or poison. Faster, even. Do you understand? Naruto cast his gaze down. Yes, cousin, he said morosely. Ken winced. Maybe he'd been a bit hard on the kid. He was only 7, after all. Hey, kiddo. Chin up. I'm not mad, I just want to make sure you don't bite off more than you can chew. That'll come at some point, it always does for ninjas. But not if you can help it, eh? Naruto grinned again and dug back into his food. This time, he kept up an almost constant stream of chatter, mostly excitement at watching Ken's examination the next morning. Ken nodded and made the occasional comment, more than happy to let Naruto take the lead in conversation. All the while, he was planning for after his exam. If he had time off, it was time Naruto began to learn what it meant to be an Uzumaki. I hope you enjoyed the what if /fanfic. See you on the next part.